The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her grip on the M240 machine gun. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of her own body after countless hours of training. She had been deployed with Navy SEAL Team 6 for 8 months now, serving as their heavy weapons specialist and medic. At 28 years old, Maria had already seen more combat than most soldiers would in an entire career. The mission had started like any other. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value Taliban commander was meeting with foreign fighters in a remote compound nestled between two mountain ridges. The location was strategically chosen by the enemy, difficult to approach, multiple escape routes, and excellent defensive positions. But SEAL Team 6 had tackled harder targets before. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison led the 12-man team as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison was a seasoned operator with over 15 years in special operations. His weathered face told stories of countless missions across Iraq, Afghanistan, and other classified locations around the globe. The team respected him not just for his rank, but for his ability to bring everyone home alive. Maria moved with practiced silence alongside Petty Officer First Class Ryan Doc Henderson, the team's primary medic. Doc was a soft-spoken man from Texas whose gentle demeanor masked a fierce warrior's heart. He had saved more lives than he could count, often under the most dangerous circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that she served as both a life-taker with her machine gun and a lifesaver with her medical training. The team included demolitions expert Chief Petty Officer Mike "Boom" Rodriguez, whose expertise with explosives had opened countless doors and eliminated numerous threats. Communications Specialist Petty Officer Second Class David Kim kept them connected to base and coordinated air support when needed. Sniper Team Leader Petty Officer First Class Tom Ghost Sullivan and his spotter Petty Officer Second Class Alex Chun provided overwatch from elevated positions. As they approached the target compound in the early morning hours, everything seemed routine. The intelligence had been solid. Thermal imaging confirmed multiple heat signatures inside the main building. The plan was textbook. Establish a perimeter, breach the compound walls, clear the buildings systematically, and extract the high-value target alive if possible. Maria positioned herself with her M240 on a small ridge overlooking the compound's main entrance. Her job was to provide suppressive fire if things went wrong and to prevent enemy reinforcements from entering the area. The machine gun was loaded with 7.62 mm NATO rounds, capable of penetrating most cover and devastating enemy positions. She had trained extensively with the weapon, learning to control its substantial recoil and manage ammunition consumption during extended firefights. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. High mud brick walls surrounded the entire complex, with only 2 known entrances. Guard towers at opposite corners provided excellent fields of fire for defenders. The terrain around the compound was mostly open ground with scattered rocks and a few small trees, offering little cover for anyone approaching. Morrison's voice crackled through their earpieces as he coordinated the assault. Overwatch, report. Ghost's calm voice responded from his sniper position 800 meters away. All quiet. No movement on the perimeter. Thermal shows 7 heat signatures in the main building, 3 in the eastern structure. Copy that. Breacher team, you're green to go. Boom moved forward with 2 other SEALs, carrying shaped charges to blow open the main gate. The explosives were precisely calculated to create an opening without bringing down the entire wall or alerting enemies too far in advance. As he worked, the rest of the team took their positions around the compound. Maria adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she had clear fields of fire across multiple approach routes. The M240 was mounted on a bipod, giving her stability for accurate long-range shots. She had additional ammunition belts ready, along with her medical kit and personal weapon. Her training had taught her to always be prepared for the unexpected. The morning air was still cool, but Maria knew the temperature would climb rapidly once the sun cleared the mountains. Sweat already beaded on her forehead under her helmet. The ceramic plates in her body armor added weight and bulk, but she had learned to move efficiently despite the extra gear. Her position offered good cover behind a cluster of rocks while maintaining visibility over the target area. Charges set, Boom reported quietly. Ready to breach on your command. Morrison scanned the compound one final time through his night vision scope. Everything appeared normal. No signs that their presence had been detected. The mission timing was critical. They needed to strike before the target could escape or call for reinforcements. Intelligence suggested the Taliban commander would leave before noon to avoid coalition air patrols. All teams, prepare for breach. Execute in 3, 2, 1 breach. The shaped charges detonated with a thunderous roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The explosion created a cloud of dust and debris as a section of the compound wall disintegrated. Before the dust had settled, Morrison and his entry team rushed through the opening, weapons raised and ready. Maria watched through her scope as the SEALs moved with practiced precision into the compound. Their movements were coordinated and efficient, each man knowing exactly where to go and what to do. Years of training and combat experience had forged them into a seamless fighting unit. The initial clearing of the courtyard went smoothly. No enemy fighters appeared to contest their entry, which struck Maria as unusual. Typically, compounds housing high-value targets were better defended. Her instincts, honed by months of combat, began sending warning signals. Something's not right, she whispered into her radio. Too easy. Morrison's voice came back immediately. Copy that, Santos. Stay alert. Beginning building clearance now. The entry team split into two groups, one heading for the main building, where thermal imaging had detected the most heat signatures, the other moving toward the eastern structure. They used standard room-clearing techniques, P&G corners, and checking for threats before advancing. As the first team reached the main building's entrance, automatic weapons fire suddenly erupted from multiple directions. The carefully planned mission instantly became a deadly trap. Muzzle flashes lit up windows in all three buildings as enemy fighters who had somehow avoided thermal detection opened fire on the exposed SEALs. Contact! Contact! Morrison's voice shouted over the radio as bullets whined through the air around his team. We've got multiple shooters in all buildings. Maria immediately began scanning for targets, her training taking over as adrenaline surged through her system. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters moving between windows, trying to get better angles on the trapped SEALs. The courtyard had become a killing zone, with her teammates caught in the open with limited cover. I've got eyes on 3 shooters in the main building, she reported, settling into her firing position. The M240's bipod legs dug into the rocky ground as she prepared to engage. Her finger found the trigger as she acquired her first target, an enemy fighter leaning out of a second-story window with an AK-47. The machine gun roared to life, sending a burst of 3 rounds toward the window. The heavy bullets tore through the mud brick wall, and the enemy fighter disappeared back inside. Maria immediately shifted to another target, maintaining a steady rate of fire to keep enemy heads down. But, as she engaged the fighters in the buildings, she noticed movement in the distance that made her blood run cold. Dust clouds on the horizon indicated vehicles approaching fast, enemy reinforcements that could turn an already desperate situation into a complete disaster. Incoming vehicles from the north, she called out over the radio. Multiple contacts, approximately 2 clicks out, and closing fast. The trap was worse than they had initially realized. Not only were there more enemy fighters in the compound than intelligence had indicated, but the Taliban had positioned additional forces to cut off any escape route. The SEALs were now facing a coordinated ambush designed to eliminate an entire special operations team. Morrison's team tried to reach cover behind a low wall in the courtyard, but enemy fire from 3 directions kept them pinned down. Bullets chipped concrete and stone around them, sending dangerous fragments flying through the air. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and they needed support immediately. Ghost, we need sniper support now, Morrison called out. Working multiple targets, came Ghost's reply, followed by the distinctive crack of his sniper rifle. Splash 1. But, even with Ghost picking off individual targets, there were too many enemy fighters for one sniper to handle effectively. The approaching vehicles would bring even more guns to bear on their position. Maria realized that her M240 machine gun might be their only hope of breaking the ambush before reinforcements arrived. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she prepared to unleash the full power of her weapon. Everything her teammates had taught her, all the training she had endured, and every lesson learned in previous firefights would be tested in the next few minutes. Their lives depended on her ability to operate that machine gun with deadly precision. As enemy fire intensified and the dust clouds of approaching vehicles grew larger, Maria Santos prepared to open up with the M240 and shatter the siege that threatened to destroy her entire team. The battle for their survival was about to begin in earnest, and she would play a crucial role in determining whether they all made it home alive. Maria Santos felt time slowed down as she processed the tactical situation developing before her eyes. The approaching vehicles were now clearly visible through her scope. 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed fighters racing across the desert toward their position. Each truck carried what appeared to be a mounted heavy machine gun or RPG launcher. Once those vehicles reached effective range, her pinned-down teammates would be caught in a devastating crossfire with no hope of escape. The enemy fighters in the compound had increased their rate of fire, apparently confident that reinforcements would soon finish off the trapped SEALs. Bullets cracked overhead constantly now, forcing Morrison's team to stay pressed against inadequate cover. Through her radio, Maria could hear the strain in her teammates' voices as they called out target locations and ammunition status. "Santos, we need that M240 singing right now." Morrison's voice carried a note of urgency that she had never heard before. The lieutenant commander was known for his calm under pressure, so his tone told her everything she needed to know about how desperate their situation had become. Maria shifted her body into the perfect firing position she had practiced thousands of times. The machine gun's bipod legs were firmly planted, her shoulder pocket properly aligned with the buttstock, and her grip exactly as her instructors had taught her. The weapon's 24-inch barrel pointed toward the main building where the heaviest enemy fire was coming from. Engaging multiple targets, she called into her radio, settling her breathing into the steady rhythm that would allow for accurate, sustained fire. The M240 erupted in a controlled burst that shook her entire body. The weapon's cyclic rate of 650 to 950 rounds per minute meant that even short bursts could deliver devastating firepower. Her first target was a window where she had seen muzzle flashes. The heavy 7.62mm rounds punched through the mud brick walls like they were made of paper, sending chunks of masonry flying in all directions. She immediately traversed to a second window where another enemy fighter was positioned. The machine gun's distinctive sound echoed off the mountains as another burst of fire silenced that position. Unlike the lighter 5.56mm rounds used by most infantry weapons, the M240's ammunition had enough mass and velocity to penetrate most cover that enemy fighters might hide behind. But Maria knew that suppressing the compound was only the first part of her challenge. Those approaching vehicles posed the greater threat, and she needed to stop them before they could bring their heavy weapons to bear. The lead truck was now less than a kilometer away and closing fast. She swung the machine gun toward the approaching convoy, adjusting her aim to account for the range and the vehicle's movement. Leading a moving target at that distance required split-second calculations based on speed, direction, and the time of flight for her bullets. Too little lead, and the rounds would pass behind the target. Too much, and they would miss ahead of it. The first burst sent tracers arcing across the desert toward the lead vehicle. Maria watched through her scope as the rounds impacted just ahead of the truck, kicking up small geysers of dirt and stone. She immediately adjusted her aim point and fired again. This time the tracers found their mark. The heavy machine gun bullets tore into the truck's engine compartment and windshield. At over 800 meters, she could see the vehicle suddenly veer to the left as the driver was either hit or lost control. The truck rolled twice before coming to rest on its side, throwing fighters from the cargo bed. "First vehicle down," she reported with satisfaction, already shifting fire to the second truck. But the remaining vehicles had spread out and were now racing toward different positions, making them harder targets. The second truck was angling toward a position that would give it cover behind a small rise in the terrain. If it reached that position, its crew would be able to set up their heavy weapons with protection from her fire. Maria sent a long burst toward the second vehicle, walking the tracers across the ground until they found the target. Several rounds struck the truck's cargo area, but it continued moving toward cover. She could see muzzle flashes from the fighters in the back who were now returning fire in her direction. Bullets began snapping past her position as the enemy fighters in the vehicles acquired her location. The distinctive crack of rounds breaking the sound barrier close to her head was a sound no combat veteran ever forgot. Some bullets struck the rocks around her position, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. Despite the incoming fire, Maria maintained her position and continued engaging targets. The third vehicle was now the biggest immediate threat, as it carried what appeared to be an RPG launcher. One well-placed rocket could eliminate her entire position and leave her teammates with no heavy weapon support. She traversed the machine gun toward the third truck and began firing controlled bursts. The vehicle was moving erratically, with its driver apparently trying to avoid her fire while simultaneously closing distance to the compound. This made aiming more difficult, but Maria had trained for exactly this type of scenario. Her fourth burst caught the truck as it crested a small hill. The tracers stitched across the vehicle from front to back, and she saw it suddenly decelerate as smoke began pouring from under the hood. The truck rolled to a stop about 600 meters from her position, and she could see figures jumping out and taking cover behind it. While she had been engaging the vehicles, the enemy fire from the compound buildings had slackened considerably. Ghost's sniper rifle continued to crack methodically as he eliminated targets, and Morrison's team had been able to advance to better cover positions in the courtyard. Outstanding work, Santos. Morrison's voice came through clearly now. Keep those vehicles suppressed while we clear these buildings. But Maria knew the fight was far from over. The fighters who had abandoned their damaged vehicles were now dismounting their heavy weapons and setting up firing positions. She could see them working frantically to establish a heavy machine gun position behind the first truck she had disabled. Once that weapon was operational, it would have enough range and firepower to seriously threaten her teammates. She swung her M240 back toward the disabled vehicles and began engaging the fighters who were trying to set up their weapons. The distance was at the maximum effective range for area targets, but well within the capabilities of her weapon and her training. Each burst was carefully aimed to disrupt their activities and force them to take cover. Through her scope, she could see the enemy fighters struggling to return effective fire at her range. Their AK-47s and other small arms didn't have the accuracy or power to consistently hit targets at 800 meters, especially when they were under fire themselves. This gave Maria a significant advantage that she intended to exploit fully. The second vehicle, which had taken damage but was still mobile, suddenly accelerated again and began racing toward a flanking position. If it reached the ridgeline to her right, its crew would be able to fire down into the compound from an elevated position, potentially hitting both her teammates and her own location. Maria had to make a quick decision. She could continue suppressing the fighters behind the first vehicle, or she could try to stop the second truck before it reached the high ground. Either choice carried risks, but allowing the enemy to gain the elevated position would be catastrophic. She swung the machine gun toward the moving vehicle and began firing long bursts, trying to stop it before it could reach cover. The truck was now moving directly away from her, presenting a smaller target profile and making range estimation more difficult. Her first several bursts fell short, kicking up dirt behind the racing vehicle. Adjusting her aim point, she elevated the barrel slightly and fired again. This time the tracers arced perfectly toward the target, and she saw sparks as rounds struck the truck's rear panels. The vehicle continued moving but was now trailing a plume of black smoke that indicated serious mechanical damage. Just as the truck began climbing the ridge, Maria's sustained fire finally found something vital. Whether it was the fuel tank, engine, or driver, the vehicle suddenly exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the early morning sky. The explosion was so violent that pieces of the truck were thrown hundreds of meters in all directions. Second vehicle eliminated, she reported, feeling a grim satisfaction at removing a major threat to her team. But her celebration was short-lived. The fighters behind the first disabled vehicle had finally succeeded in setting up their heavy machine gun, and it was now beginning to fire in her direction. The heavier caliber rounds packed much more punch than the small arms fire she had been receiving, and they were tearing apart her rocky cover with frightening effectiveness. Large chunks of stone exploded around her position as the enemy heavy weapon found its range. Maria realized she needed to relocate immediately or risk being eliminated by the superior firepower now being directed at her. But moving would leave her teammates without machine gun support at a critical moment in their assault on the compound buildings. The decision was taken out of her hands when a burst of heavy machine gun fire struck the rocks directly in front of her position, showering her with sharp fragments and temporarily blinding her with dust and debris. She rolled to her left, dragging the M240 with her toward a secondary position she had identified earlier. As she moved, she could hear Morrison's team beginning their assault on the main building. Explosions echoed across the compound as they used grenades to clear rooms, followed by the distinctive sound of close-quarters combat. Every second she was out of action was another second that her teammates faced enemy fire without her support. Maria reached her new position and quickly set up the machine gun again. From this angle, she had a better view of the enemy heavy weapon position, and she could see the muzzle flashes clearly. The enemy crew was focused on her previous location and hadn't yet realized she had moved. She took careful aim at the heavy machine gun position and fired a sustained burst. The M240's bullets found their mark, and she saw the enemy weapon suddenly go silent. Whether she had hit the crew or damaged the gun itself, the immediate threat had been neutralized. But even as she eliminated one threat, Maria could see more enemy fighters moving through the terrain around the compound. The initial ambush had been just the beginning of what was clearly a much larger operation designed to eliminate her entire team. The real test of her skills and determination was yet to come. The battlefield had evolved into a complex three-dimensional chess game, with Maria Santos holding one of the most critical pieces. From her elevated position, she could see the entire tactical situation unfolding below. Her teammates had successfully breached the main building and were systematically clearing rooms, but new threats continued to emerge from unexpected directions. Through her scope, Maria spotted movement on the far ridgeline. At least a dozen fighters were working their way along the high ground, clearly attempting to set up a flanking position that would give them clear shots into the compound. If they succeeded in establishing themselves there, Morrison's team would be caught in a deadly crossfire with no escape route. "Commander, you've got enemy movement on the northern ridgeline," she reported into her radio while maintaining visual contact with the advancing fighters. "Looks like a squad-sized element trying to flank us." Morrison's voice came back strained but controlled. "Copy that, Santos. We're neck-deep in contact here. Can you interdict?" Maria quickly calculated the range to the ridgeline, approximately 1,200 meters, near the maximum effective range for her M240 against point targets. The distance would make precision shots difficult, but the elevated position of the enemy fighters made them visible against the skyline. She would have to rely on the machine gun's area suppression capabilities rather than precision marksmanship. "I can keep their heads down, but I can't eliminate them all at this range," she responded honestly. "You need to expedite that building clearance." As she spoke, Maria was already adjusting her aim toward the distant ridgeline. The fighters there were moving in a tactical formation, using available cover and advancing by bounds. These weren't the typical Taliban foot soldiers they usually encountered. Their movement suggested better training and discipline. She fired a series of controlled bursts toward the ridgeline, walking the tracers along the suspected positions of the advancing fighters. At that range, she couldn't see the immediate effects of her fire, but the purpose was to force them to take cover and slow their advance while her teammates completed their mission in the compound. The M240's ammunition consumption was becoming a concern. She had already expended several hundred rounds, and the belted ammunition that remained would have to last until the team could extract. Each burst had to be calculated not just for immediate effect, but for long-term sustainability. While she engaged the distant targets, the situation in the compound continued to deteriorate. Through her radio, she could hear the intense fighting as Morrison's team cleared room after room. The distinctive sounds of flashbang grenades, automatic weapons fire, and shouted commands painted a picture of desperate close-quarters combat. "Building 1 secure," came Doc Henderson's voice over the radio. No sign of the primary target. "Moving to Building 2. That was troubling news. If their high-value target wasn't in the main building, he might have already escaped, or worse, the entire intelligence package could have been compromised. They might be fighting, and dying for nothing more than a handful of Taliban foot soldiers. Maria's attention was suddenly drawn back to her immediate area by movement much closer than the ridgeline. 3 enemy fighters had somehow worked their way to within 300 meters of her position and were now climbing toward her through the rocky terrain. They had approached from her blind spot, using the natural terrain features to mask their movement. This presented a serious tactical dilemma. The approaching fighters were close enough to pose an immediate threat to her position with small arms fire and grenades. But if she turned her attention away from the compound and ridgeline to deal with them, her teammates would lose their heavy weapon support at a critical moment. The lead fighter was now close enough that she could see him clearly through her scope. He carried an RPG launcher along with his rifle, a weapon that could easily destroy her position with a single well-placed shot. The other 2 fighters were providing security and carrying additional ammunition for both small arms and the rocket launcher. Maria made a quick tactical decision. She would have to trust in her teammates' ability to handle the compound fight while she dealt with the immediate threat to her own position. If these fighters eliminated her, the entire team would be left without machine gun support against multiple enemy forces. She swung the M240 around to face the approaching threat and immediately engaged the lead fighter. At 300 meters, her first burst was devastating. The heavy machine gun bullets struck with tremendous force, and the RPG threat was eliminated before he could bring his weapon to bear. The remaining 2 fighters immediately took cover behind a cluster of large rocks and began returning fire with their AK-47s. Their bullets cracked past Maria's position as they tried to pin her down and maneuver closer. She could hear them shouting commands to each other in Pashto as they coordinated their assault. Using short, controlled bursts, Maria kept the 2 fighters suppressed while trying to maneuver to a position where she could get clear shots. The rocky terrain that provided her with cover also gave the enemy fighters multiple concealment options. This type of close-range firefight was exactly what she had trained for, but it was always more intense and chaotic in real combat. One of the fighters attempted to bound forward to a better firing position, exposing himself for just a few seconds as he moved between rocks. Maria was ready for the movement and caught him with a 3-round burst that ended his advance permanently. The precision required to hit a moving target at that range while under fire was a testament to her training and combat experience. The surviving fighter realized he was outgunned and began attempting to withdraw from the engagement. But Maria couldn't allow him to escape and potentially report her position to other enemy forces. She maintained pressure with precise bursts that forced him to keep his head down while she maneuvered for a better angle. As she engaged this close-range threat, her radio crackled with increasingly urgent traffic from the compound. Morrison's team had encountered heavy resistance in the second building and was requesting immediate support. Ghost's sniper rifle continued to crack methodically, but even his precision fire couldn't eliminate targets fast enough to keep up with the emerging threats. "Santos, we need that 240 back on the compound now." Morrison's voice carried a note of desperation that made Maria's blood run cold. "We've got multiple fighters with automatic weapons in elevated positions." She managed to eliminate the last close-range threat with a final burst and immediately swung her weapon back toward the compound. What she saw through her scope made her heart sink. While she had been dealing with the flanking attack on her position, the enemy fighters on the ridgeline had successfully established firing positions that dominated the compound's courtyard. Her teammates were now trapped in the buildings with limited ability to move between structures. The enemy fighters on the ridgeline had clear fields of fire into the courtyard and were using automatic weapons to keep the SEALs pinned down. Any attempt to move between buildings or extract from the compound would result in casualties. Maria immediately began engaging the ridgeline positions with sustained fire. The range was still at the maximum effective distance for her weapon, but she had to try to suppress the enemy fire enough to give her teammates some freedom of movement. Each burst was carefully aimed at the muzzle flashes she could see along the ridgeline. The tactical situation had reached a critical point. Her ammunition was running low, her teammates were pinned down in the compound buildings, and enemy reinforcements could arrive at any moment. The mission had become a fight for survival, with the odds stacked heavily against them. But Maria Santos had not survived 8 months of combat operations by giving up when things looked hopeless. She had seen desperate situations before and had learned that determination and accurate fire could often turn the tide when conventional tactics failed. The M240 in her hands represented the difference between her team's survival and destruction. As enemy fire continued to pour down from the ridgeline, Maria settled into a steady rhythm of controlled bursts. She was no longer thinking about mission objectives or high-value targets. Her entire focus had narrowed to the mechanical process of engaging targets and keeping her teammates alive. Every round fired had to count. Every target engaged had to be eliminated or suppressed. The sound of her machine gun echoed across the mountains as she unleashed the full fury of her weapon against the enemy positions. The fate of her entire team now rested on her ability to break the siege that threatened to destroy them all. In the next few minutes, Maria Santos would either prove herself as the warrior her teammates believed her to be, or they would all pay the ultimate price for their mission. Through the scope of her M240, she could see the enemy fighters continuing to pour fire into the compound. But she could also see something else, the fear in their movements as her heavy machine gun rounds began finding their marks. They had expected to eliminate a trapped team of special operations soldiers, but they hadn't counted on facing a determined machine gunner who refused to let her teammates die. The siege was about to be shattered, one precisely aimed burst at a time. The moment had arrived when everything Maria Santos had learned about combat, leadership, and sacrifice would be tested in the crucible of life and death. Her M240 machine gun had become more than just a weapon. It was the lifeline connecting her trapped teammates to survival. With less than 200 rounds remaining in her ammunition supply, every trigger pull had to serve a purpose. The enemy fighters on the ridgeline had established what they believed was an impregnable position. Their elevation gave them clear fields of fire into the compound, and they had arranged their forces in mutually supporting positions that covered each other's blind spots. It was a textbook defensive setup that should have been impossible for a single machine gunner to overcome. But Maria had advantages that the enemy fighters didn't fully understand. Her M240 fired a much heavier bullet with significantly more range and penetrating power than their AK-47s and light machine guns. More importantly, she had been trained to use that weapon with precision that turned area suppression into targeted elimination. Each 3 to 5 round burst was aimed with the accuracy of a sniper rifle. She began working systematically along the ridgeline, identifying individual firing positions and engaging them with deliberate precision. Her first target was an enemy machine gun team that had been pouring the heaviest fire into the compound. Through her scope, she could see the crew operating what appeared to be a PCAM machine gun from behind a low stone wall. Maria aimed carefully at the center of their position and fired a sustained burst of 8 rounds. The heavy bullets tore through the stone wall as if it were made of cardboard, and the enemy machine gun suddenly fell silent. She immediately shifted to the next position before any return fire could be directed at her location. The psychological effect of her accurate fire was almost as important as the physical destruction. The enemy fighters had expected to face trapped soldiers with limited heavy weapons capability. Instead, they found themselves being systematically eliminated by a machine gunner who seemed to hit whatever she aimed at, regardless of cover or distance. "Santos, whatever you're doing up there, keep it up." Morrison's voice came through her radio with the first note of optimism she had heard in the past hour. "Enemy fire is slackening significantly." Through her scope, she could see her teammates beginning to move more freely within the compound. Doc Henderson had managed to reach the 3rd building and was coordinating with Boom Rodriguez to clear the remaining structures. The reduced enemy fire from the ridgeline was giving them the tactical breathing room they desperately needed. But Maria knew she couldn't maintain this rate of fire indefinitely. Her ammunition situation was becoming critical, and she could see additional enemy fighters moving along the ridgeline to reinforce the positions she had just eliminated. The enemy commander was clearly trying to mass enough firepower to overwhelm her single weapon. She made a tactical decision that went against standard machine gun doctrine, but suited their desperate circumstances. Instead of providing area suppression, she would use precise shots to eliminate key targets and create maximum psychological impact. Each round would be aimed with the precision of a sniper, turning her machine gun into a devastating precision instrument. Her next target was an enemy fighter who appeared to be a leader, based on his position and the way other fighters were responding to his signals. The man was positioned behind cover that would normally protect him from small arms fire, but the M240's heavy bullets punched through his concealment with lethal effect. His elimination caused visible confusion among the nearby enemy fighters. Working methodically from north to south along the ridgeline, Maria continued eliminating key positions and personnel. Her training had taught her to identify the most critical targets: communications personnel, heavy weapons crews, and apparent leaders. By removing these key elements, she could disrupt the enemy's coordination and reduce their overall effectiveness. The enemy fighters began to realize that their elevated positions, which had seemed so advantageous, were actually making them easy targets for the precise machine gun fire. Several fighters abandoned their positions and began moving toward lower ground, reducing their effectiveness against the compound, but also making Maria's job easier. Through her radio, she could hear the sounds of her teammates' assault reaching its climax. Explosions echoed from the compound buildings as they used breaching charges and grenades to clear the final rooms. The distinctive sound patterns told her that they were winning the close-quarters fight, but the battle wasn't over yet. "Building 3 secure," came Boom's voice over the radio. "We've got the jackpot. HVT is alive and secured." That news sent a surge of adrenaline through Maria's system. They had found their high-value target alive, which meant the mission could still be considered a success if they could extract safely. But getting out of their current position would require eliminating the remaining threats and establishing a secure extraction route. Ghost's voice crackled through the radio from his sniper position. "Santos, I count at least 15 enemy fighters still active on the ridgeline and in the surrounding terrain. They're starting to mass for what looks like a final assault." Maria could see the movement Ghost was referring to. The surviving enemy fighters were abandoning their individual positions and consolidating into larger groups. This suggested they were preparing for a coordinated attack, probably hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers rather than tactical superiority. She had to make her remaining ammunition count more than ever. Instead of engaging the consolidating groups directly, she decided to target their movement routes and force them to take longer, more exposed paths toward the compound. By controlling their movement, she could buy time for her teammates to prepare defensive positions. Her fire shifted to natural choke points along the ridgeline, where enemy fighters would be forced to expose themselves as they moved. Each burst was timed to catch groups of fighters as they attempted to bound between cover positions. The psychological effect was devastating. The enemy forces found themselves trapped in a deadly zone where any movement drew immediate and accurate machine gun fire. Morrison's voice came through the radio with new urgency. "All teams prepare for extraction. Santos, can you provide covering fire for our movement to the extract LZ?" The extraction landing zone was located 800 meters north of the compound, requiring the team to cross open ground while potentially under fire from multiple directions. Maria's position would allow her to cover most of their movement route, but she would have to carefully manage her remaining ammunition. "Copy that, Commander. I can cover your movement, but my ammo situation is critical. You need to move fast." As her teammates prepared to extract from the compound with their captured target, Maria began her final engagement of the battle. The enemy fighters had realized that the SEALs were attempting to escape and were massing for a desperate attempt to prevent their extraction. This would be their last chance to turn a failed ambush into a victory. Maria watched through her scope as nearly 20 enemy fighters began moving toward positions that would allow them to fire on the extraction route. They were abandoning tactical caution in favor of speed, hoping to reach firing positions before the extraction could be completed. This gave Maria the opportunity she had been waiting for. Instead of engaging individual targets, she could now use her machine gun in its intended role as an area weapon, sweeping groups of exposed fighters with devastating effect. The enemy's desperation had made them vulnerable to the very tactics they had been avoiding all morning. She opened fire with sustained bursts, walking the machine gun's fire along the ridgeline where the enemy fighters were advancing. The effect was catastrophic for the attacking force. Multiple fighters were eliminated immediately, and the survivors were forced to take cover in positions that offered no view of the extraction route. "Moving now," Morrison called out as his team began their sprint toward the landing zone. Maria shifted her fire to provide a moving curtain of bullets that stayed ahead of her teammates as they crossed the open ground. Any enemy fighter who attempted to engage the moving seals found himself immediately under accurate machine gun fire from Maria's position. The distinctive sound of approaching helicopters began to echo off the mountains as their extraction aircraft arrived on schedule. The timing was perfect. Her teammates reached the landing zone just as the helicopters touched down, with Maria's covering fire keeping all enemy threats suppressed. "Santos, time to go." Morrison's voice carried across the radio as the helicopters prepared to lift off. But Maria faced a final tactical challenge. Her current position was too far from the landing zone to reach on foot before the helicopters would be forced to depart. She would have to cover her own withdrawal while under fire from any surviving enemy fighters. She began moving toward the extraction point while continuing to engage targets with short, controlled bursts. The M240's bipod had to be collapsed, forcing her to fire from improvised positions as she bounded between cover points. This was the most dangerous part of the entire engagement. A single well-aimed enemy shot could end everything. Her training took over as she moved with the fluid motion of a combat veteran. Each movement was calculated to minimize exposure while maintaining the ability to return effective fire. The weight of the machine gun and her equipment made the movement exhausting, but adrenaline and determination carried her forward. As she neared the landing zone, her last few rounds eliminated a final group of enemy fighters who had managed to reach a position overlooking the extraction site. The machine gun fell silent as she expended her final ammunition, but the threat had been neutralized. Strong hands pulled her aboard the helicopter as it lifted off from the landing zone. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the battlefield they were leaving behind, a scene of destruction that testified to the power of accurate machine gun fire and the determination of a single soldier who refused to let her teammates die. Morrison's hand fell on her shoulder as the helicopter climbed towards safety. "Outstanding work, Santos. That 240 saved all our lives today." As they flew toward their base with the high-value target secured, Maria Santos reflected on the battle that had tested every aspect of her training and character. She had faced overwhelming odds with a single weapon and had emerged victorious through skill, courage, and the unbreakable bond that connected her to her teammates. The siege had been shattered not through overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but through the precise application of military skills and the unwavering determination of a soldier who understood that sometimes one person with the right weapon in the right place could change the course of an entire battle. Maria Santos had become that person, and her actions would be remembered and studied for years to come as an example of what could be accomplished when training, courage, and determination came together in the crucible of combat.